price is born, the 529 account sort of thing, that, percentage of the sales tax or some goes through it, and in a decade or two built down. Every possible.
We're going to get started. Have you take your seat. Okay. And I'm going to have you.
I don't know what's better. Just the perfect to be problematic either way. Okay. All right. Good enough. Good afternoon. My name is Ralph Martire. I'm the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy here at Roosevelt University, one of the most wonderful institutions on the face of the earth. And before I get into some introductions of our distinguished panel and our moderator, I do want to have a thank you for Mr. Herb Franks. Today's event, in fact, is made possible by the generosity of Mr. Herb Franks. He's a 1954 graduate of Roosevelt University's Heller College of Business. He's the former Assistant General Attorney of Illinois. He currently serves as a senior partner in the law firm of Franks, Gherkin, Ponce, and Greeley. He's the son of immigrant parents, and something he shares in common with many of today's students. Herb understands the fight for the American dream. And through his generous contributions to Roosevelt University, he is seeking to promote a clearer understanding of state and local politics. Herb, I really want to thank you for endowing this important seminar. The work, the discussion, the things we talk about here at Roosevelt in reconsidering the American dream, crucial for the future of our country. Now, I'm going to jump into introducing our distinguished panel here, and my introduction is not going to do any of them credit. This is truly a panel of heroes and a moderator who's a hero. But I will start with former Congressman Mike Honda. He spent 16 years in Congress. He served the House Democratic Steering Committee for Policy, and he served on the House Appropriations Committee. He led the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He led the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. He helped form the LGBT Equality Caucus. But he has a bit of a history. And during World War II, his family was imprisoned in an internment camp for the Japanese. They stayed imprisoned even though his father joined the U.S. Military Intelligence Service and helped teach Japanese to U.S. servicemen, and in fact served so honorably he received the Congressional Gold Medal in honor of his service as his family remained imprisoned. So if there's someone who could talk about the American dream, maybe it's Congressman Honda, but he can really talk about it when it comes to education. So now I'm going to talk about how I know the congressman. A number of years ago, he established a committee through a congressional resolution that was going to look at excellence and equity in public education funding, housed in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education. Now, I got appointed to serve on that commission, so I got to meet Congressman Honda. He spent his entire career, from the time I've known him, trying to make a better, more intelligent federal investment in K-12 education so that every child in America could walk into her or his neighborhood school and receive the type of education they need to be competitive in today's global economy. Mike is a former educator, he's a teacher, he's been a principal, and he's really, really going to bring a lot of depth and value to this panel. Now let's talk about our two state legislators here. First, I'm going to start with Leader Lightford. Now, Kimberly, you know, your resume that's available online is woefully inadequate for everything you've done. I really want to say that as my starting point, Madam Leader. And, you know, it notes the committee she serves on, education, financial institutions. It notes that she's a member of the National Black Caucus of Elected Officers and the National League of Cities. And she's co-chair of a commission on intergovernmental cooperation, which talk about getting entities to engage in an unnatural act. I think intergovernment cooperation qualifies. But what you may not know is Illinois passed a new school funding formula in the year 2017. In fact, signed into law on August 31st, 2017. The reason that was so momentous, when people woke up that morning in Illinois before this law was signed, they woke up in the state that had the least equitable school funding formula in all of America. But after that legislation was signed, they went to bed in the state that had the best. We would not have gotten that school funding reform passed but for the leadership of one Senator Lightford. She is the primary reason we have a new school funding formula in Illinois. And then there's Senator Christina Pacione-Zayas. You know, I'm a professor here. You're meeting one of my professors. I actually had her teaching me in the, remember that, the MacArthur Fellowship on early childhood. And she's got a great background in education like you wouldn't believe. I mean, she's, let's see, I want to make sure I get them all right. She was with the Erickson Institute. She was on the State Board of Education where she served as a secretary. She was with Enlace Chicago and worked with CPS schools. She was on J.B. Pritzker's transition team that was focused on educational success. She was director of advanced education policy at the Latino Policy Forum. She's got a little bit of a background in education and really understands it from a civil rights standpoint as well as from a practitioner standpoint. And then we get to our moderator, Amisha Cross. Anybody here attend Roosevelt University? Amisha Cross, among all her other accolades, is a Roosevelt University grad. She has built an incredibly successful career for herself. She's currently serving as a political commentator on TV and radio back in Washington, D.C. But before that, she served as the governmental relations director for Noble Charter Schools. She's also served, and I want to get this right, as the director of policy and external relations for the National Black Child Development Institute. In her past, as an advocate, she's worked on everything from helping the National Urban League, the Rainbow Push Coalition, the NAACP, to working literally on prohibiting local law enforcement agencies from getting engaged in utilizing immigration status as a reason to go after people. Tremendous background in civil rights. And I am honored to say she is one of the best students I have ever had here at Roosevelt University. And I could not be more proud of anyone. If she was my own daughter, I could not be more proud. Which brings us to today's panel. And I'm just going to make a couple of comments about that and then turn this over to Amisha. W.B. Du Bois once said, either America and what it will stand for will destroy ignorance, or ignorance will destroy America. And he was talking about public education. And I don't think truer words could be said today. If you look at the scope of the national discussion on politics, all you hear is vitriol and not very much informed by data. It's really bringing us to a place of ignorance we cannot afford to be. And when I say we can't afford it, I mean that literally from an economic standpoint, because the correlations between educational attainment and economic viability in the modern economy are stronger than they have ever been in the past. For instance, in 1980, a college grad earned 30% more than a high school grad. Today, that's up to 45% more. Someone with an advanced degree earned 41% more than a high school grad back in 1980. That is up to almost 60% more today. And when you look at it, every state in America that has done a better job of investing in its K-12 education system has seen a statistically significant advantage over its other states in everything ranging from mean and median wage to per capita GDP growth. If we don't get education right, and if we don't give all our children access to a quality education, we are harming them economically. We are denying their opportunity to be a viable earner in the modern economy. And there are no counter data to that. But what is scary about the data is what happens when poverty enters the equation. Now, you may not know this, but 52% of the children who attend public schools in the US today are low income, over half, 52%. That's a challenge, because when you look at the test scores of American kids and you compare them to other children internationally, the PISA exams, you see some very interesting trends when you break those test scores down by income level. So overall, the US is sort of a midland performer on these test scores. In fact, we're below the OECD average in math, and we're right about it in language arts. However, if you look at the school districts in America that have 0 to 10% poverty, #1 in the world. School districts in America, 10 to 25% poverty, 4th in the world, #1 in the world on these test scores compared to other nations with a similar poverty demographic. Our test scores don't fall off the map in America until poverty gets to exceed 25% in a school district. 52% of our children attending public schools are low income. We have to make an investment that reaches low-income schools, or we are denying opportunity to half the kids. Now, race is a hot-button issue today, and we should know that there are racial impacts of our disinvestment in low-income children. 74% of our Latino students attend a school where the concentrated low-income percentage is over 50 points. 73% of our African-American kids attend such a school. That percentage drops down to about 36% for Asians and Pacific Islanders, and down to 31% for white kids. So we have a system in America of financing public education today that disadvantages low-income children generally, and specifically singles out Black and brown children for a particularly poorly funded education at a time when education matters more than ever to being competitive in the global economy. It's not okay, but our panelists have answers. And if you want hope for America, its future, and our education system, just look at the people you have situated here. They are making a difference in our country today so that everyone could have a brighter future tomorrow. And with that, I will turn it over to my student.
Thank you so much. Could not have asked for a better introduction. I'm still kind of overwhelmed. Thank you all for being here. It's not remiss to me, or I think anyone in this audience, just how long, and how true your devotion is to education, to young people, to the future of our communities, to the future of America, which resembles the people on this stage right now. When we talk about education and we hear a lot of the statistics, a lot of the numbers that were just thrown out, I think that they are a jolt for many people who aren't necessarily as engaged in this type of work. But we also have to remember that a lot of this comes on the backdrop of one of the most challenging years that education and society has ever had in this country, with the backdrop of COVID-19. Leader Lightfoot, I'm going to start with you. Specifically around, we just saw the reinstitution of the budget and what it looks like for schools across the state of Illinois, particularly the effects on Black and brown communities and the districts in which they serve. How has COVID-19 caused upheaval, not only in that process, but also in some of the issues that you're seeing elevated around protection of students as they return back to school with COVID-19, the massive amount of students who have exodus from the system because of those threats posed by COVID-19 and the pressure that the teachers themselves face?
Thank you for the question. And I have to start back from the very beginning when COVID first hit. The Senate established a education committee that was just addressing those pressing issues that COVID was creating, like lack of connectivity in the Black and brown communities. Not that they were not all over the state, but there was a huge focus on making sure kids were connected to Wi-Fi and able to be in the classroom. We found that to be a huge challenge for many months when we first got started, which would parlay over into the academic achievement gap widening in these particular areas. So now that we're returning back to school, having addressed food deserts, communities where kids live in food deserts, where having, free and reduced breakfast and lunch was really healthy meals for them, having to ensure that they were in safe environments. There was a lot of trauma. So now we've welcomed these children back, and now they've been even more so afflicted with trauma. The gap has widened, and we're learning how to reposition children who are now a year further behind than possibly when they left the system prior to COVID. So there's a lot of challenges that we're addressing. I think we're getting lost into the conversation of mask or no mask and vaccination or no vaccination. There's not enough discussion around loss of academic time. And what are we doing to make sure that we're bringing these kids up to a place where they should be? So is the funding from the federal government adequate enough to address marginalized communities and focused on giving those kids additional instruction that they may need? So I took that on with the Black Caucus to ensure that there was supports for after school programs, that there was mentoring, that there was opportunities for summer learning, summer camps coming up, and during holiday breaks. I think that we focused on releasing kids for Christmas break and spring break, and we're all excited, but we have work to do to catch these kids up. So there should be a virtual learning opportunities to help fill some of those gaps. And a lot of just a whole lot more tutoring for those grandparents who was raising their grandchildren who had 5th grade math and they're in their 80s and they're calling my office, Senator Lightford, can you help me with my 5th grader with math? And I said, well, I don't know if I can, but I can. I am not smarter than a 5th grader, but I found that out. But what I can do is make a very good effort in making sure that those opportunities are available. So when we talk about access and we talk about opportunity and equity, they all play the same role, but there's differences in children and where they live based on their race or just the communities that they come from. If they're in poverty-stricken communities, if they're children from the LGBT community, just the challenges they face that are in addition to what other kids generally do.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for highlighting the ongoing traumas, because we have not automatically school started back and parents and communities and those young people are out of those things. They still carry that burden with them. Congressman Honda, when we were talking in the green room, you talked about the importance of having not only diverse teachers, but also those who understand and can motivate students, particularly those who come from various backgrounds where there are multiple languages spoken in the home.
Sure.
And because you actually have experience in that and have worked on it, what are some of the tips that you would give school districts, particularly those that serve diverse learners who don't necessarily have that capacity? We know that over 80% of K through 12 teachers are white females. They don't resemble the students that they serve. How can we influence that pipeline and get more of those teachers who adequately can culturally, but also just in terms of making these students feel at home, have that level of responsiveness to the students and the communities that they serve?
You're referring to a school that I became a principal of that had 30% Vietnamese, 30% Cambodian, 30% Latinos, and probably a couple of percent others. And the premise was that we had to have instructors that could reflect, one, the language and culture of the students. They had to be trained as teachers, but we had to go out and look for them. So I just went out in different school districts and recruited teachers from other school districts and brought them to my school, challenging them that, we have Vietnamese, they need instruction in language they understand best. And not to push English first, but to push the content and comprehension. And then as they move through the educational experience, they will pick up English. And so it turns out that our 3 strands of bilingual education and recruiting on a long-term basis and making sure that the hiring of folks and training of teacher helpers also was paramount in reflecting the needs of the child, not responding to the needs of the school district and assigning teachers because they happen to be there. That was one. And then on weekends, I used to ask myself, why are schools closed on weekends? Because it should be used. And I saw that the Vietnamese were teaching their youngsters language and culture on Saturdays on the floor of a library. So I brought them into my school and said, on Saturdays, you can have Vietnamese language and culture so that the maintenance of the language and the culture will be there as they become socialized in our country and in the English language. And because I always felt that, there was a saying that, if you speak 2 languages, you walk in 2 worlds. Cada cabeza es un mundo, ¿verdad? And so with that premise and understanding that, I spoke Japanese when I went to kindergarten, but I lost it. I don't even remember it. So these youngsters, I don't believe should have given up their language and their culture to be educated in this country, but to be able to be bilingual, bicultural, and biliterate. And this was a very poor school. I mean, we had Cambodians, 5 families living in an apartment. And so it was about addressing the needs of the youngsters and addressing it and applying research, comprehensible input. You have to use the language they understand best. And then also time on task. If you have to spend extra time, you did that. And then establishing the stability of the family and recognizing that 5 families in 1 apartment is something that's not new to them. So do not apply the city's standards of only having 1 family per apartment and get rid of the other 4. That wasn't going to work in our community. And so I've learned a lot by listening to them and them teaching me to be a better administrator.
Absolutely. I think that that's something we can all, take away from. There are so many things that happen in the home or in the community that greatly impact what you're able to not only see yourself in terms of future opportunities, but also for young people and for teachers themselves, the way in which they have to reach those students.
Right.
Just because everybody's situation is different. And there are some cultural awarenesses that I think have to be had for you to be able to really reach and really work with not only the students, but the families as well.
Right.
And Christina, this one's for you. I had the honor of working with the Chicago Youth Centers. It was one of the things that I did early on in my career here, starting on the Southeast Side and South Shore, and then going to Bridgeport. Culture shock to a certain extent. I went from having students that I largely work with in after school programs and weekends, there's supplementary education for reading, writing, math, a audience of 98% African-American students to an audience of 87% Latino students. Our center in Bridgeport only had 2 Latino teachers. Everyone else was not. And part of the push that the schools had, as well as the push that the Chicago Youth Centers had at the time, was to move away from punishing parents. And I say that because the idea was that if parents aren't involved in these parent groups, these conversations with teachers, these conversations with staff, if they can't come here during the time that we've allotted for it, then that means these parents don't care.
Yeah.
What we found was that in many instances, these parents were working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. They were traveling across the city. Some worked in the suburbs. They were doing everything they could to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, not feeling either comfortable talking about it to teachers or to staff, but also feeling as though they were being held to a model that they could not achieve themselves. What are some of the ideas that you have around the development or the outreach in terms of parent involvement that actually works for parents who do have to, work these jobs that would prevent them from being able to meet during the traditional set times, but also around how to have those conversations as an administrator or as a teacher with parents who not only is English not their first language, but they might not feel comfortable with some of the preconceived notions that often come from administrators, specifically towards Latino families.
Okay. Ooh, like that one. Also, and thank you for this conversation. This is like panelist fire. So I think what I'd offer for that is you have to have a grassroots, robust ground game when it comes to families. You have to meet families where they're at. You cannot assume that you set up, you build the school, they will come, right? And I actually spent some time in Little Village, as Ralph had mentioned, within La City, Chicago. I was a community schools director. And the community schools model is that, to Congressman Honda's point, we stayed open all the time. We were open till 8 o'clock at night, on the weekends, during the summer breaks. The idea was that the school was a hub for community activity. The school wasn't just about the academic learning. It was about the character development, leadership development, creative expression. We brought in programs that would assist families with financial stability, achieving educational goals, and also having stronger relationships and connections with their own children. And I think when you make the school a space that has kind of this multifaceted way that it meets the needs of a community, you're not going to have a problem with parental engagement. I think the other model that is really strong here in the state, and I'm really proud that we more than doubled the investment in the budget, is the Parent Mentor Program. This is a program that comes out of a grassroots organization that basically works with parents, primarily immigrant moms, who want to help in the school but don't know how. And what they actually end up becoming is an extra set of hands in the classroom to assist the teacher to work with smaller groups, particularly because they come with bilingual skills. They're able to kind of facilitate that support, but they also learn how to navigate the school space so much that many of them end up getting hired by the school. And so that model actually during COVID turned into what they called a mobile parent mentor program, in which schools were utilizing these parent mentors to go out to families to, 1, check on families, make sure that children were there and families got what they needed, but 2, to provide some supplemental assistance, because then they were jumping in on the Zoom and the Google and all of that. The point is that we have to look at parents as resources and families as resources. And Luis Moll talks about funds of knowledge. Parents have inherently these funds of knowledge. We just have to create spaces where that can come out and be supported and integrate in the school.
Absolutely. And Senator Lightford, so there's obviously an elephant in the room today when we talk about education. Largely, it's an election day. And there isn't a more hot button issue for anyone who's running for governor. We've seen it in Virginia. We've seen it other places as well. Mayor's races across the country. Then education happens to be. On the one hand, I'm thankful because sometimes it's not talked about in the context it needs to. On the other hand, I'm upset that critical race theory, which is not taught in any K through 12 setting in America, is actually their point of push here. What we've seen is a move towards giving school boards more power, a push towards parents being louder and angrier about the diversity of their schools and the diversity of teaching that exists in them. But it doesn't necessarily jive with the numbers. You and I think everybody on this stage has read American history books, and they largely don't include the stories of people who look like us, at least not in their entirety. We know that the teacher workforce is getting whiter every day. It's not becoming any more black and brown. We know that there are pipeline issues with the teacher workforce. What are some of your ideas about, one, how this could be contextualized? Because I've seen it fall apart from a lot of Democrats who are running in various states, but also where you think this is going, because the way that education has now become this extremely polarized and hot button issue is not necessarily the comments that you were talking about earlier. We know that there are challenges. We know that there are opportunities. Those aren't the things that are being elevated in news. Those aren't the things that are being elevated on policy platforms. What should Democrats know running for office? What should parents know when they want to see change in their education system? What are some of the policies that you would personally want to see advocated for to move out of this very odd CRT space, but things that actually matter in education? What are some of those things to you?
Well, first, I just want to mention the huge disconnect. There's a huge disconnect between a person who says, I'm seeking office, so I'm going to say education, because that's code word for being reelected or being elected, because everyone should care about education, but then becoming a legislator and not focus on that same thing you ran for. Like, do you really feel compassionate about improving the education system? So for me, over the years, seeing so many of my colleagues use it as a point of candidacy, but then not actually, I'm excited, like, ooh, I've got somebody new to work with, and then they don't deliver that, except this young lady here. So Christina is a different type of person when it comes to that. So, but prior to her, I was like so happy to have her, but prior to her, it would just fall on deaf ears once they became the legislator, which is not great news, but I'm being honest. But what I think is important for us to talk about, we do support local control because we have over 800 odd school districts in the state, and they're all very different. So some things you do need to leave that to that board to make the decision on how it best fits their school district. However, when they're not included inclusive history, when we're not teaching all history about all people, and it's still pretty one-sided, one-jaded, that's where we're coming up with a country that's pretty one-sided, that's pretty just jaded to this one particular race as being the be-all, when it's not necessary. It's not true. It's not even that it's not necessarily true. It's just not true. And so when we talk about in the legislature, I just passed this really big omnibus bill to make sure that we include history. So there's a commission right now that's working to bring recommendations and findings back to the General Assembly on how to have an inclusive American history courses being taught. Then when you talk about trauma, you kind of got to look at the whole child. And so I established this whole child task force to also take a look at how do we define trauma, and then how do we create trauma schools and trauma communities, trauma-free communities and schools. So believe it or not, that took us about 3 months just to come up with some definitions, because it's that critical when we talk about the difference in black and white, and when we talk about educating all children. There is this divide. There is this a solid divide line on there's too much money in education or we funded it enough, but it's not really addressing the needs of the kids who need it the most. So if you have to restructure how we fund the schools, when we finally came up with the evidence-based funding model, that was a way of structuring to ensure that the funds were equally distributed based on need, and that we can get at those adequacy targets and get those kids up who are the furthest from being adequate. But that's just a segment of it, because then when you say, well, you need to make a shift over here, a shift over there, no one wants to lose what they already have. So we get into the bigger problem of how do we generate new revenue to make sure that it's enough revenue being put into the education pot that's spread it across the way that it should be. So now we're talking about a structural system, you know, a racist at best system that's been embedded in the practices and the procedures. And the more and more is being unfolded, the more I'm blown away with the reasons why I feel the way that I do after 23 years in the legislature. I've been fighting against that brick wall all of this time, trying to just bring a access to Black students. And so finally, when you talk about, we were talking about foreign language, when we talk about that, what is the language for Black Americans? What's our language? You know, we don't speak French. You go to other countries and you see your people and they all speak different languages, then we're just tied to the American English language. But why aren't our kids learning additional languages? It shouldn't be that it's just an elective. It should be that kids are required as young as kindergarten to begin learning a foreign language so that they too can be a dual language speaker. But the focus has not been on Black children's success. I mean, we can take this all the way back to fights and with Brown versus Board of Education of Black people not being able to learn and being in these schools that were not inclusive of them having a good quality education. So if you fast forward that to 2021, we're still fighting the same challenges that were sought after in the Brown versus Board of Education, but it just looks a little different, but the outcome is the same. Kids are leaving our school system unable to pass a basic entrance exam into a community college. Kids are leaving the system with no skill sets. Many of them are still first generation family members if they're lucky enough to go to college, but the rest of them that didn't make it to the higher education concept or have the heart to know that they can make it or do it, they have no skill sets. We removed all of those CTE programs. We removed the workforce development opportunities out of the high schools. And now we have this huge population of Black students between 16 and 24, uneducated. They're out of work, they're out of schools. You all see them, they're hanging out on the streets. And then we say, what's wrong with those Black people, right? Everything is wrong. From the very beginning, when we don't adequately bring them into pre-K, we do nothing to address any type of trauma, mental health. So we added all of that. So I added a provision around kindergarten readiness. I added an adventure around mental health consultations. I added some earlier things in the pre-K space. And then from there, all the way through K through 12. And especially dealing with the low number of professional teachers, minority teachers. Once you leave outside of Cook County and the collar counties, it's less than 2% of minority teachers across the rest of the state. There are school districts that have absolutely no minority teachers. So trying to create that pathway with our minority teach scholarship piece, we increased the award amount. We did a set aside specifically for minority male teachers, and we're trying to do the best we can to create pathways in foreign language, as well as science and math and some of those other areas that are really difficult to staff.
Absolutely. And I've worked with Teach National in DC in conjunction with Senator Cory Booker's office. Illinois was highlighted for the work there, specifically around trying to diversify the teaching workforce, because that has been something that the Senate has broadly been working to push for a long time, with the recognition that it doesn't matter whether you're in a red state, a blue state, a purple state, or anywhere in between. We just do not have a pipeline of teachers of color. We do not have a pipeline of teachers who speak diverse languages. We don't have a pipeline of teachers who come from diverse backgrounds. The majority of our current teaching staff are people who just happen to be white women from middle-class backgrounds. And we place them in some of the hardest hit communities across the country and expect them to be able to not only stay, for, in some cases, 30, 40 years, which that just doesn't happen anymore. They're lucky if they last for 3 to 5. But in addition to that, being able to really relate to the students with the social emotional issues, with the traumas, with the backgrounds of sometimes, being parents themselves in terms of having to come to school but take care of their younger siblings. I've worked with some of those students. It's not that they don't care about school. It's not that they aren't paying attention to you when you're teaching. It is literally that this kid might have been up till 4 or 5 a.m. helping with his younger sibling who happens to be a toddler. There are a lot of issues associated with this. They don't think if you don't either come from that background or have an understanding of the community itself, you're going to really understand. And in many instances, those students are punished for things that they have to do at home. And I think that, from what we've heard here and what we just heard specifically, there's a lot more that we can do in that vein. With all that being said, we had a conversation before coming out, and I'm going to stick with you on this one, Leader Lightford. We talked about basically, or I said at least, you were Black Lives Matter before Black Lives Matter had a hashtag. You've been someone from a state that largely from people who don't come from Illinois see as extremely progressive, being on the forefront of change. You know that that's not always the case, specifically when it comes to equity for Black people, equity for minorities in general. And when we talk about education specifically, it is noted that today we have more segregated schools than we did at the height of the civil rights movement. That's just facts across this country. You received a lot of pushback for the equity policies that you were pushing, for the conversations that you were having. You became known as the angry Black woman. It's a badge that you carry with honor these days. How did you navigate all of that?
Well,
She was bad.
it's definitely a badge of honor that I come to love. I didn't know quite what I was doing, how to do it, because I've been in a system with colleagues since 1998 that I thought all cared enough about all children in education. So as I chaired the Senate Education for many years, and I would begin to recognize that I couldn't get my colleagues to move on certain things if they were downstate Illinois, if they were suburban Illinois, there is this big myth because you all are Democrats, you have the votes, you can make it happen. But we all come from different parts of the state and we represent different people. And it's very difficult at times when you're looking at the data and you can go to your colleague and say, your school district has the lowest performing kids in the state. Would you like to help on school reform? And you still cannot get a yes vote from that person. It's very difficult because then in a way it gets personal. And then I became angry or viewed as angry by me being honest enough to say that you have the lowest performing amount of kids, in the entire state, and you're doing nothing to help them. So when I would speak out about it, then I was angry. When I didn't talk, oh, she's got an attitude. So it was kind of hard to find where to fit. But for me, my journey was clear in terms of improving the conditions for all kids. I just feel like you're born into a situation, and sometimes that situation could be that you're born to some of the wealthiest people and you live a lavish life. You don't even know poverty if it stared you in the face. And then there are some kids, they grow, they're raised, they're born into poverty, and that's all they know. They don't know the outside. I feel like I failed somewhere in there in the middle where I was poor and didn't know it because I had parents that made it look like it wasn't as bad as it really was. But I took that to the State House and I said, if I could be the first person in my family to earn a college degree, then why aren't all our kids being as successful? If I could come from a home that was stricken, although I had both parents, I come from an abusive home. If I can be a trauma-inflicted child myself, what is my driver? What moves me? And I took that desire and heart to the legislature. And I've always been this kid at heart, like know what the kids need because I knew what I needed. I knew what was missing. I knew what other kids needed. But trying to get my colleagues to see that has been difficult over the years. I've seen colleagues come and go and there's no improvements made. But, last year with COVID-19 and with the George Floyd incident, for me, it was that moment that I've been waiting for my entire career. It was that moment that I knew everyone was paying attention, and that I had to seize that moment and make something happen that was going to be helpful for the human race overall. Nothing personal accolades for Kimberly, no personal accolades for just the legislature there, but who are we helping? Who are we impacting? The lives that can be changed if we just give them a better education opportunity, if we give them a better workforce development opportunity, if we give them quality health care, if we give them economic opportunities, if they're able to get a loan one day from a bank to buy a home, if they're able to, just have a living wage that's respected, and it's not a minimum wage leveled, lifestyle that they live, then they would have an opportunity to be successful. So that's my whole goal, is how can I help ensure that every person born, whether they're born to the wealthiest people or the poorest people, that they have a chance to reach their fullest potential, that they have an opportunity.
And you've been doing that for quite some time.
I have been. I've cried myself through. I'm a big crybaby too, but I stuck with it. And I'm hoping that Ralph's laughing at me because he knows I'm a crybaby. Can you imagine your lead negotiator? I'm negotiating and I'm crying at the same time. But that's getting it done. And that leads me back to just when I first met Ralph in 2003. He's been a teacher of mine, but in a different way in the General Assembly. I questioned our newly elected governor. We had a big education meeting of the whole on the Senate floor. Everyone had to be there. The governor gets up. I'm the first question. And I said to the governor, what are you going to do to close the academic achievement gap? And that's when Ralph became my best friend, because people will skirt around the issues. And just because you ran for office, well, you ran for office as a governor saying you were going to do these things. So was that inappropriate of me to ask? So that's another angry Black woman moment where I wasn't supposed to ask the question, but I had to ask the question.
If this is the composition of an angry Black woman, we need more.
Okay, good.
and it's their problem, not your problem.
Yeah, I've learned quite a few ways in my journey, just how to approach situations differently. And for me, what was most important was that my colleagues during this process was learning as I was learning, and that we were all looking at the data together, and that we were all learning from other stakeholders in the state that provides these services, what their needs and challenges were. So I would ask the question, how can you better serve the community that you're serving? What can we do as a state? And that's when I was learning where all the loopholes were and where the challenges were, and then being able to create that into some policy that's going to be beneficial for all students, and particularly kids from marginalized communities.
Thank you. And Congressman Honda, I know that you were a leader in the DNC, and particularly during a very interesting time frame in our nation's history around and we've seen nationalized education policy come and go, and in most cases it has failed. You were there during the NCLB No Child Left Behind years. What were your comments on not only why it basically left every child behind, but also how can a national education policy actually work on the state level when, as Leader Lightfoot said just a few moments ago, there are so many nuances locally?
Two thoughts. One is, a lot of times the federal government and our policymakers from the federal government don't know what the hell they're doing in terms of education. They don't understand education. They may have a golden calf they want to be able to tout, but it's nonetheless a golden calf. And the other is the No Child Left Behind was not about a child. It was about, getting accountability without the resources and without the backup to be able to understand that if you don't want to leave any child behind, then you better know the needs of each and every child, one. And the way you do that is you assess every child, and then you say to yourself, we're going to apply the necessary resources to achieve that level. Now, states, we know, and the senators here know, and Ralph as well, that the states cannot rise to the level of adequacy funding for each child's needs, because it's going to be astronomical. But you do what you can under the evidence-based funding that you've done here in the state of Illinois, and that's why I'm here, is to steal stuff from you. and then partnership with the feds, that the shortfall, the delta between what the states can achieve and what you really need to achieve for the child, that delta is where the feds come in as partners. And that's kind of a bill that Robin Kelly's carrying for us to make that happen. And if we can't make other states like Illinois to be able to understand that this is the first step towards equity funding for our children, and forget about everything else that we talk about, race to the top, no child left behind. None of that is child focused based on their assessed needs and the resources necessary to do that. Illinois is achieving that, but they need the help from the federal government. And I think you got 50 states, 50 different systems. The 50 states ought to get together, or the parents ought to get together and sue each other and sue the federal government for that consideration, because under the 14th Amendment, every child deserves equal protection. And that's how the civil rights movement started. And this is a civil rights issue for our kids.
And Christina, we know that, as was previously stated, this is a civil rights issue. And again, it is one that is coming up in states and localities across the country. I think that the more diverse the nation becomes, particularly with more parents of color moving to different suburban areas, now the conversation is even elevated there, because we know that even in schools that are seen as top performing schools, the divergence between the education that Latino students in those schools get and African-American students in those schools get is very large from what the white students in those same schools get. At what point do you feel like there are, I think, advantages that came out of the COVID-19 model? Because there are some significant changes, just like there was during the election, where we saw that, things were adapted to make voting easier. And now in certain states, they're trying to rewind all the way back to Jim Crow. What are some of the changes that you saw work in education? We know that virtual learning didn't work for everybody, but there are some benefits to what some schools have been able to do over the past year.
Yeah, I think the advantage that COVID brought us is similar to the unfortunate advantage that the moment when we witnessed George Floyd being murdered. You can't unsee what you saw, right? So no more arguments about this. No more, we have to have a mountain of evidence to explain why we need to have differentiated learning, why we need to focus on mental health and wellness and social emotional learning, why assessments, particularly high stakes ones, are inappropriate for moments like this. How we need to reconsider how we measure progress, and that we provide the wraparound supports to get at the root causes of why we have gaps in the first place. The system was not designed to teach a diverse population. The system assumes that you are white, middle class, status quo, able-bodied, heterosexual, everything, and that English is your only language. So every other student that comes into a schoolhouse is like they call it subtractive education. Angela Valenzuela always talks about you're asked to subtract who you are in order to succeed. And I think that has put a lot of these discussions on the table, hence the whole CRT debate, because I'm like, CRT's been around for a minute. You guys are kind of tardy to the party if you're upset about it. But I think what it has really been able to do is uncover and grapple with a lot of our root cause issues in terms of making sure that we have curriculum that reflects the identity and affirms the identity, the history, the contribution. I mean, I think about Leader Lightford's article within the cleanup bill that with freedom schools. We're going to have freedom schools here in Illinois. That is huge. And there's money for it too. It's not just an unfunded mandate. We're going to also have, significant money going into mental health services, not only for children and their families, but also the educators. Right now, this is a period where it is no way, shape, or form attractive to be an educator. You are a target on so many levels, and the assumption is that your labor is to be exploited so that we can perform and do all these tests and make the companies that create the tests and the curriculums richer. The point is, we can now have an honest conversation about how all that is distraction. And we are not, to Congressman Honda's point, centering on the child.
Love that.
And Leader Lightford, you brought up something earlier, and I go back to it because I've made my rounds through the education forum, working in CPS, both for charter schools as well as for community schools, but also serving in leadership at City Colleges of Chicago. With that being said, you struck a really serious chord when you mentioned the people who technically do graduate, who walk away with their, high school diplomas, walk into city colleges and have to go through significant remediation. Mm-hmm. What we found during my tenure there was that students who came in with a CPS high school diploma had the same reading, writing, and math levels as ESL students who were just getting started learning the English language. Mm-hmm. These are kids who had gone through CPS K through 12. Students who English is the only language spoken in their homes. The average course of remediation in City Colleges of Chicago and 75% of community colleges across the country is 6 years. 6 years in remediation. That means 6 years where you're not getting any college credit at all. Because remediation you can take, and they will take your federal funding dollars for it. That means any grant money or any monies you got from your FAFSA. Meanwhile, you are getting absolutely no credit and cannot take a college course that will give you credit until you get through remediation. Mm-hmm. By the year 2032, it is estimated that 78% of American students will be functionally illiterate, reading on the second grade level. What can we do? Because this is a huge fight that nobody's really talking about in the context that they should. These aren't people who decidedly left school early. These are people who went through the entire course, K through 12, and are still not advantaged by the system in any way. How do we change that?
My smart, short, angry Black woman answer is, if I knew, I'd have done it a long time ago. Because it's so difficult watching generations of kids that I know aren't prepared already leave the high school system pretty much and just get pushed on. So when I talk about those kids, what we just did and what I just did also is focused on high school graduation requirements. And I was so disturbed to find out that our own University of Illinois flagship, one of our state schools, some schools are teaching to what their requirements are, when many schools, and especially schools in Tier 1 schools and schools in Black communities, they're not teaching to any acceptance. They're not teaching to see what's needed or required to be at city colleges, Triton College, or any other college. They're not looking to see what's needed at the university level. So in my research, when I found out that we were not ensuring at Tier 1 schools and schools of color, there was a percentage we put in place of Black students that they were not actually receiving remedial courses, they were not receiving accelerated courses, they were not receiving any type of advanced placement, they were not being required 2 years of laboratory science, 2 years of foreign language. These are just basic high school requirements that were missing. So they're teaching them enough to push them out of school. And as a parent, you're proud of your child's accomplishments until you learn that the standards that they taught your child at were mid-level at best and not accepted anywhere. And so we worked with the community college board and the board of higher ed to talk about making sure kids are transferred in properly when they leave community college to higher ed without losing hours, but we focus heavily on kids being accepted into community college level ready to go. So between K through 12, which we focus really 9 through 12, and then the efforts to get that kid to a college space and not have to take a whole year or two of remedial courses that affects their Pell Grant, their MAP grant. They can't make it financially, then they just give up. So we are really focused in that space right now. The Illinois Board of Higher Education is setting up this 10-year plan that we're working on right now as we're talking to make sure that there's a better transition. I believe that when all of our requirements kick in with our upcoming new school year, you're going to find that there are some challenges because there's not enough teachers to teach the foreign language, the technology, et cetera, the science, the math, right? But then does that mean our kids don't deserve it? I mean, there's a responsibility to make sure that they're being taught at the same level to achieve accomplishment. So a lot of that is factored into House Bill 2170. I would encourage all of you to take a look at it. There is about 30-some different articles that I impacted or affected. And we have a huge portion on high school acceleration and community college acceptance.
And I asked that question because right now there's such the focus around what's happening at the national level related to the Build Back Better agenda and what it meant to not have free community college basically in that bill. Now we're moving on to universal pre-K and trying to figure out if it's going to actually make it to the end or not. You talked about some of the budgeting around pre-K in Illinois earlier. Christina, this question's for you though, around pre-K and how it has been administered throughout the state. We know that certain areas have more viable pre-K opportunities than others do. We know that there is a cost barrier to many parents. We also know that, again, the quality is different depending on where you are. I know that this conversation was coaxed in K through 12. Well, everyone on this panel has acknowledged that education does not start in kindergarten. We know that our earliest learners are definitely disadvantaged if they don't receive the proper education, one that puts them on the forefront when they are in their earliest years. With that being said, what are some of your hopes for universal pre-K or your hopes for how pre-K is going across the state right now?
So right before the pandemic, the governor impaneled a commission focused on early childhood funding and equity. And really excited about that because, like many states in Illinois, we just have a very fragmented, malaligned, not coordinated system of birth to 5. I think what's really important to always acknowledge is we even have to go before pre-K and think about infant toddler support and interventions because, learning starts actually before birth in so many ways. But the point is that in our state, when I met with the governor right before he got the recommendations from the funding commission, which basically were charged to do 3 things. They wanted to we needed to find out what is the true cost to have a fully funded birth to 5 system that's coordinated and aligned. And we found out that price tag is $14.6 billion. Right now, we put about 1.7 billion. So we've got some work to do. The second piece was, what is the governance structure? Because we now spread our early childhood programs and services across 7 different areas. And so is it consolidating in one central area? Is it creating a whole new, agency, so on and so forth? And the last one is, how do we get the money out the door? Because there's a lot of inequity with that in terms of the providers not being able to access funds, which hits our whole price point piece, which hits our whole access piece. And so all of those things are finally now enshrined in some recommendations that we can move on as a state. And when I met with the governor, right before the recommendations were going to come out, this was earlier in this calendar year, he was like, man, I'm so disappointed. It's wonderful. We're going to have these recs, but I'm not going to be able to close that gap in terms of the funding. And I was like, look at it this way. At least we have a blueprint. We've had a robust early childhood field, and advocacy space, but we've never had where we've all sat around the table, came up with the plan, said, these are the definitions, this is how we're going to move it, so on and so forth. Now we have that. And so I think the main thing, all those pieces that you just talked about, where we are really struggling as a state is actually enrollment. We lost a lot of young children participating in these programs. And one of the first things that the state is going to do, and this is what I'm hopeful for, is stand up a regional hub system across our state so that we have what we call community collaboratives and community collaborations, where we have tables of stakeholders from all different parts of the community that come together to develop a coordinated strategy for birth to 5. Well, they're now going to get the infrastructure support and financing to be able to take that kind of planning to the next level, to just get our roles back up and to from a local perspective, address it and not just have a cookie cutter approach. I think when we reinforce the ground game, when we invest and honor that the wisdom is in the room and at the community level, I think that's going to set us for a firm foundation so that when these federal funds flow, because there's going to be, and they better, I have to say, they will be hearing from me if they don't. They already took out parental leave. I'm not okay with that. They took out my free community college. I'm not okay with that. I recall some people running on this particular platform very poignantly. And so I will let them know, can't do that to the babies. So the point is that I think Illinois is setting its infrastructure up to really be able to do the investment and the transformational work that's needed for our youngest children to set the foundation for K-12 and beyond.
I told you I was happy to get it, right?
The entire state should be happy to have you. Congressman, when we talk about education specifically, like we've had this conversation here, and I think that's one that's being held around kitchen tables across the country at this point, just because it is such an elevated and now extremely partisan issue. Again, we've watched things go bad nationally when it comes to trying to decide policy, but we also have not always seen them go exceptionally well locally, particularly because, to Christina's point a moment ago, a lot of the people who need to be the voices at the table aren't at the table. From my work at the Noble Network of Charter Schools, one of the things that I set out to do was get parents ready, particularly parents from diverse communities who did not feel like, one, it was their place to actually meet with legislators like yourself, like Leader Lightford, who did not know how to have those conversations, who felt like that was in some ways very foreign and above their skis to a certain extent. And it was a method of trying to empower them to say that it's not just you having meetings with your teachers. These people are also accessible to you, to talk about what you would like to see happen in your school. So talk about what you would like to see your students be able to achieve, to talk about, hey, you want those honors classes. Hey, you want those, you want more teachers' aides and assistants to be able to, make things manifest in the classroom, particularly for those diverse learners, but also to talk about the structural issues that just happen to be a part of the system in and of itself. I would be remiss to not point that out, that we do have several parents who, when it comes to political leadership, don't necessarily always feel comfortable bringing their issues to the table. So they're honestly depending on other people to advocate for them, even though in many cases they know the issues very well that are affecting not only their community, but also their students' education. What are some of your thoughts about ways to make parents feel more comfortable with those conversations? Because it is a particular highlighting moment in communities of color, diverse communities, and impoverished communities, because I can tell you from working with students' parents in the Appalachia, from working with student parents across rural America, and from working with some white students' parents and more, and more highly funded suburban communities, they don't have that same issue. They will go up and hoot and holler about every little thing about their school to their leaders in a way that we don't see that happening often in diverse communities.
Two things come to mind. One is a lot of times parents have to hear from folks like Lyford and Pacione-Zayas, Christina, to have them hear them speak the way they speak. Because once parents start hearing legislators, they say it validates their own experience, and they said, it's like being in church. You could be up there preaching, and once they start to resonate with the what's being spoken to, then you start to gain more and more impetus from the parents, and they get more confidence that, you know, they've been right all the time. We call that mother wit, right? And so we have to do that. That's why I'm here, to steal some of the folks here, to bring them to California to talk to our folks over there. Because if it doesn't happen at the state level, this movement for equity is never going to happen at the federal level. Because, you know, unless people leave the schools, unless people just drop everything and just will not participate and start to practice civil disobedience. Once you start practicing civil disobedience, you get the politicians' attention. And I was listening to Kennedy's speech about going to the moon, and he said, we're going to the moon not because it's easy, because it's hard. But then he said, and other things. And then at the end, he says, we're going to do this in this decade. We're going to the moon and other things. Now, I read that, other things. That was a time of Vietnam War, discord in this country, civil rights movement and stuff like that. And he wanted to let people know there's a mission, but I haven't forgotten about your stuff. We just have to make sure that our political leadership understand what the hell we want to see for our kids. You know, they can talk the good talk, but they got to come up with something. And, you know, I'm 80 years old. I've heard it all. I want to see something that Illinois has done at other state levels so that we can start to really push for the bill that we have with Ralph and our bipartisan team to push this bill that Robin Kelly's carrying. And our state legislators and our state congressional members have to start pushing this too. Everybody thinks they're experts in education because they went through the system, right? But they have no clue what it really means to teach a class of youngsters that's diverse and needy. It is hard work. It is really, really stressful, because you want to make sure that each child is getting what that child deserves. And that's the kind of pressure that I think we need to put on our policymakers to become more astute and learn it. Because if they didn't have their background and stuck to their sense of what's right, they call it angry Black woman, but she stuck to what was right. It was other people's problems because they didn't want to deal with it. Because if they had to deal with it, then they have to accept that it's not only a Black problem or a brown problem or an Asian problem. It's every child who's poor, who's disenfranchised. And on top of that, there's got to be a civil rights movement for children. And it's got to be at the scale of the civil rights of the 50s. And in the 50s, without TV and the things that was going on down south, going into other people's homes, the movement would have been slower. Today's technology, time and distance is nothing. So we should be able to take advantage of our technology and make sure that everybody understands that these children are suffering every day. I got started on this because I read Jonathan Coulson's book on savage inequalities. But his flaw is that he was looking at the symptoms and saying, we got to do something about it, and he's right. But he didn't have the solution. The solution is the equity solution for each child and being able to address each child's needs and fund it appropriately. Otherwise, the civil rights and equal protection is just a phrase. And our Constitution was not built on inclusion.
At all.
Our Constitution is built on exclusion. And we were not part of the design when they wrote the Constitution. We had to make ourselves included. And that took a lot of work. Bunch of angry white women, bunch of angry Latinas, and black women, you know, the suffrage, and everybody had to fight for a piece of the action and push that contract out further. And I think the biggest civil rights movement right now is for our children. And we're losing them on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, they're required to go to school for 10 years. And if you come out of 10 years of schooling and you can't read or write, someone did not fulfill their contract. And that 10 years became a definitive sentencing rather than an educational experience. You can't have that.
And on that exceptional bookend, we are going to open it up for questions.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Hi.
I'm Tom Fillion. I'm Dean of the College of Education here. On the one hand, I just want to say thank you for all the work that all of you have done over the last several years. It's been really important. For Roosevelt in particular, just want to call your attention to the fact over the last 4 years, our enrollment in teacher preparation programs has grown by about 70%. And thank you. And we're allied with you, very concerned about minority representation within the workforce and teacher candidates. In the last 2 years, we've grown our African-American population by 39%. Last 4 years, Latino population by about 32%. And a lot of that is due to the teacher residency grants that we've been funding here in Illinois. They've been hugely valuable for us. We have a great partnership with CPS and have just launched a new alternative licensure program in South Cook County, which is hugely interesting.
Very good.
My question has to do with, last 2 weekends, I've spent some time traveling through Southern Michigan and Southern Illinois. And as I go through some of the small towns, I see what looks to me a little bit like poverty, dilapidated barns, houses, etc. And I'm struck that you haven't touched on yet sort of the particular needs of rural states and rural areas. And it's really complex because, as you pointed out, outside of the, this area of the state, you see, the diverse populations diminish, especially among teachers. And I'm just curious, does it deserve a special call out? And if it does, meaning rural education in particular, and if it does deserve a call out, what are some of the things maybe we should be thinking about in terms of enhancing education in the rural parts of the states? Because I'm really concerned about it. We had a good lecture yesterday about polarization in the country. And I just really worry if we let part of this state continue to feel like they're not getting the resources that they need or the support that they need, and I think that's a complicated interpretation too, that will just continue to have kind of the debates that take us away from the focus on kids that you're all arguing for.
Well, I guess I could start just in that congratulations on all the great work you're doing here at the university, and a huge congratulations to your increases of student enrollment amongst diverse students. When I think of my relationship with rural Illinois, everything that I advocate for has always included rural Illinois. I don't know that I see differences when I see student needs. I just see students, what their needs are, no matter where they are in the stage. So a lot of legislation that I've done over the years always include rural Illinois. All of the discussions and the debates that we have with education stakeholders, we always take into account rural Illinois, the diversity and challenges in transportation for them, just challenges in distance, population, how many, the small towns with very few students, just different populations, all of those things. We hugely take into account for rural Illinois. So by no means have they been exempt from any conversations that I've been a part of in education for the last 23 years. Now, what you see visually, the barns that you may see is no different from the foreclosures that I see. There is no difference. I think the challenges that we see just in the divide of either you have it or you don't. I think that's what you're witnessing when you ride through rural Illinois. You see more of the don't because there's so much land out there and you can kind of see it. And then when you come into the urban areas, I see them, but we're all stacked on top of each other and we're very close in it. But the needs are the same. And I spend a lot of times trying to articulate that to my colleagues who represents those spaces to speak up for it. That was my example I gave earlier. I didn't go too grave into it, but a lot of my downstate colleagues would not speak up and say, hey, we're a poor rural community. Other than Senator Andy Menard was the first downstate legislator that I've worked with, other than Vince DiMuzio, which Vince, had to leave the legislature in like 2000, maybe 2002. There was no other downstate legislators to take on that fight with me and say, the all-purpose room, our lunchroom where our kids eat is also our gymnasium, which is also our art room. No one else would speak up and fight for their kids if they were on the lower level. And I don't understand that for the life of me. So if we can have a sidebar and you can help me understand why downstate Illinois legislators who are from poor areas or may have poor pockets in their district will not fight for them as hard as they speak up for the other areas of their district.
So those schools, in the rural schools, are they experiencing an increase in funding because of the funding mechanism?
Some of those schools are tier 1 schools. So when we did break out our evidence-based funding model, it didn't decipher rural Illinois versus the suburban Illinois versus Chicago urban area. Pretty much it was the adequacy level of the students within that district. So surprisingly, Chicago is a tier 2 school district, right, and not a tier 1. The assumption was that Chicago would be a tier 1 school district. But once we began to release data and information, we found that there was a lot of tier 1 schools that were from downstate Illinois, but we couldn't get their very own legislator who represent them to speak up and advocate for them. I see Ralph is at the mic, which is
chomping at the bit because, I'm a little pregnant with the evidence-based model.
Just a little pregnant.
Yeah.
So as Senator Lightford's technical advisor, I helped draft it with a guy named Mike Jacoby. And the first time you put that in was like 7 years before it passed, just so that you know.
We worked on it for a long time. So here's the good news on the answer to your question. The good news is it's not a zero-sum game. So the reforms that Kimberly Lightford fought so diligently for in the Senate on our school funding formula are good for all children in the state. And I'll give you an example. Not counting this year's new funding that'll go into education because we don't know how it'll be distributed yet. About $967 million new money has gone into the new school funding formula, the evidence-based formula, over and above the past. And when you look at a geographic breakdown of the distribution of that money, the most of it has gone downstate. The biggest tranche, $340 million roughly, has gone south of I-80 to schools that are virtually all white but have a lot of poverty. So the model
is incredibly equitable in how it distributes new school funding proceeds, no matter what your definition of equity is, whether it's racial or income-based. And part of the reasons for that is it takes into account local capacity. So as Senator Lightford was saying, City of Chicago doesn't get quite what you think, because unlike a lot of poor school districts, it has a lot of property wealth. You know, these school districts downstate simply don't have the property wealth. And so they've actually done very well. And since I'm not in the General Assembly, I'll just answer the political question.
I tried.
I'm not going to be as diplomatic as you, Senator, but that's okay. I'm not known for my diplomacy. So I've done a lot of speaking on this bill when it was going to pass. And I will tell you the primary reason we got pushback in mostly white communities that were downstate is they didn't want new money going to those schools for those kids, meaning Black children living in Chicago. It was purely a racial pushback. And we even got some of that pushback from the governor at the time, Governor Rauner. So racism is a very real thing. And a lot of times people can use code words to describe it or to hide it and pretend like they're talking about something else. But really, the geographic politics in Illinois are very much racial politics. So it was overcoming that racial concern by explaining how the evidence-based model worked. And it was in the interest of all children. And to Senator Lightford and Senator Pacione-Zayas, if I mispronounced it, Pacione should be Italian, right? With a C-I-Ch. Right.
Pacione-Zayas.
Pacione-Zayas. They've both fought for reforms that are good for all children. And education funding reform isn't a zero-sum game. We're not taking away from these kids to give to those kids. We're creating greater capacity for all school districts that have been significantly underfunded in Illinois for generations, and many of those school districts are south of I-80 in all white poor communities.
And if I could say quickly, it's a good observation when you went to southern Michigan, but it's also in Appalachia. So it's not only about race and poverty, but it's also about, if you focus on the child's need, you assess them, and you put the resource on top, the money will come and to support that child, and then the school district will be able to look at a greater source of income. But they have to do what Illinois had done to shift that funding mechanism in a different way, and that's why we're working also with Robin Kelly to push a federal bill that will supplement the shortfall that the state's always going to be encountering. So, and if we address places like Southern Michigan, Appalachia, Southern Illinois, the previous president's hold on people's minds will probably be a lot less. Be a lot less anger out there too.
And one quick point before we move on to another question, to follow up on what Professor Martire said, as someone who was educated in the great state of Mississippi, at the end of the day, I think in large part, there is a very strong issue around race and education have always been intertwined and have always been extremely polarizing. That existed before Trump. It will exist long after Trump. And I feel as though, to Professor Martire's point, there has been a push and pull and a tug of war, specifically in rural areas, around not wanting to see funding for Black kids, period. Even if it was at the behest of helping also extremely poor white kids. So we've seen that day in and day out in multiple places across the country, not just downstate Illinois, not just downstate New York. We've seen it in areas where, yes, you will see the dilapidated buildings, you will see large expanses of land, you will see people who technically qualify for food stamps and other sources of social programs because of the sheer poverty that exists in those areas, but because some of that monies would also go to benefit children of color, they will consistently vote against those interests. And I think we have another question.
Thank you for saying that.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to mention a few points that were made. Someone on the panel mentioned about there should be taught more different languages in the schools, and students who come there who are already immigrants, they have difficulty with the English language. But I wanted to mention that all the tests that are given in English. So that is a problem with these immigrant students, that they have to learn the English language quite well because the tests are all given in English. So that is the reason there's a push to teach English. Yes, there should be more languages taught, maybe at the elementary level, because I did meet an Italian family and the parents only spoke Italian. But I found out that the students at the 5th grade level were taught English. So they came to America just to visit, but the children had to translate for the parents. So they were given this opportunity at the 5th grade level so that they could speak both languages. I also wanted to mention that we speak about teachers, but I think grooming administrators is far more important, because when I first started teaching, I was under a very great administrator. I taught in a project area, low income, but the teachers enjoyed this administrator so much that we look forward to teaching in this project area. So an administrator can really make a difference. The teachers did not leave. It's only when she left that we began to go to other schools. But an administrator can really make a difference in an area.
So thank you for the comment, and I'm not sure it was a question there, but to respond, yes, children will have to take tests in English somewhere along the line. In our bilingual strands, English, Spanish, and Cambodian, if we're giving tests for progress and for content, then English is not important. It's the content and the grasp of the content, the comprehension. So a lot of times we will speak to the child in the language they understand to see if they can respond back appropriately on the content, okay? And eventually they will learn the English and be able to do that later on. But we will not penalize youngsters and test them in a language that they don't comprehend. It doesn't make any sense. Research shows that. And Lau versus Nichols, the Supreme Court ruling, said that, you know, youngsters have to be able to be taught in a language that they understand, they comprehend. So the comprehensible input has to be appropriate for them to learn, understanding that they will learn English as they move forward in their academic careers. And so,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to just say, if I can just add one thing, the concept is called metalinguistic awareness. Basically, when you have the infrastructure for one language and you are presented with a second language, you want to strengthen the first language so that that can be the crossover to acquire the second language. We're missing out on huge opportunities if we don't strengthen that home language first to then be able to pick up the second language. There's cognitive flexibility involved. You're able to also have what they call executive functioning skills at a higher capacity, which is proven to show that it has better academic outcomes. So it's a missed opportunity if we don't support and strengthen those languages. And to Congressman Honda's point, the test is only testing your ability to comprehend English and not your mastery of the content. So it's a false notion in the first place.
And a lot of my teachers used to say, I don't know why we have to do this because they speak English already. Well, there's a difference between playground English and the classroom of instruction English.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand that, then the youngsters start to feel a little bit more burden about understanding what's being taught. They become reluctant learners, or and somehow we just have to understand that so that we can encourage them to, ask questions and things like that. But the language of the playground is much different from the language of the classroom.
I think there's one
Out
more.
of time.
Oh, I'm sorry. We are out of time. I am so sorry. No, thank you
Our
all.
apologies.
I think that everyone definitely illuminated this discussion. We hit on diversity. We talked about the issues in K-12. We talked about the opportunities in K-12. We talked about universal pre-K. And we talked about, I think, something that isn't talked about nearly enough. And thank you, Christina, for pointing it out, that education starts in the womb, period. There is a huge movement in DC around 0 to 3. Birth to 3 years old. It's a conversation we largely don't have in education, but we need to start having it. So thank you for illuminating that. To Leader Lightford, you've always been an inspiration to me. So it was just great to sit here next to you, to be honest, let some of that Black girl magic just, shed on me somehow. But this has been an amazing opportunity. I thank you guys for the opportunity and the great questions. It's been great.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, our apologies from our students. They had to go to class. Otherwise, they would get in trouble with the professors and so forth. Just a couple of comments. Leader Lightford, Congressman Honda, Dr. Pacione-Zayas, thank you so much for being here. And of course, our own alum, Ms. Cross, thank you so much for a wonderful job. Congressman Hanna, you mentioned that during President Kennedy's years, we went to the moon during the Vietnam War, of course. And of course, reminder to everyone that during Civil War, we had land grants given to every state so that we could have a University of Illinois and Wisconsin and so forth, which brought us to today. The question is, what is the next thing we're going to do? Where are those legislators, just like you, and our national representatives that are going to fund our schools? I'm sorry, $14 billion for the future of our state. My message to Governor Pritzker is find the money. Okay? Our students deserve that. And yes, we need to teach critical race theory, and we need to teach about the 1619 Project and the plantation and the internment camps and everything else we do. Because this is the future sitting right here in front of you. And it's right now multicultural. It's not just biracial, bicultural, it's multicultural. I have a granddaughter who is quadruple racial. So I don't know how she's going to identify herself later on when she gets to that age.
She'll do
From this. Yeah, exactly. That basically I'm an American. So that's what we're trying to build a nation for. And you're absolutely right. It starts with preschool and every effort that you have shown and all the innovation in the schools in California. And we all need to fight for our schools. So thank you everyone for being here, and Ralph for fighting for the school funding. It's not enough, my friend. It's not enough. So please do more with everybody's help. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.